Okay, recording has begun. So I will share this window, I guess. Yeah. So well, I don't know about the rest of you, but I think it's a good idea to have a little meta discussion uh, about like what can we expect to do as initial goals. Because I'm feeling a little unclear about that. There we go. Okay, there's some minutes. Um, uh, but 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 in addition to that, I'll just quickly drop some notes from what we had last time. Um, if my uh, paper will load. And if I can, this is obviously wrong. I don't think we had this discussion on a date that hasn't yet occurred. Pretty sure. Must have been this. In any case, at the end of this, we sort of had some list of things here that we didn't talk about and could have talked about, or we thought about talking about. I think overall WG procedure was basically this meta discussion I'm talking about. But also
do you have links to these somewhere in a doc somewhere?
They're in this folder. There's also summaries of them in the Lang team repo, which is
I found it in the
better.
Yeah.
Under
I found
here.
the one from. Got it.
Yeah.
Got it.
In general, I try to keep some things here. So in frozen format. So yeah, so these were some of the other things. Conflict, how to have controversial conversations and conflict resolution, how to manage deeply technical conversations, how to select what we do and when and how should a working group end, and do we want a formal staging mechanism, and what is it? I thought, well, I'll let other people weigh in here for a moment in terms of shaping today's agenda. Any thoughts? Well, what I was thinking is that I think staging and this meta are kind of similar. Like, specifically, I would like to think about what is a kind of MVP. What is some minimal changes we can make to improve our lives? And to some extent, we have made a little bit of that already, in the sense that the.
So I have some ideas around this. We don't have to overhaul the RC process at once, like in one big RC. We could, for example, like with the RCs, meta RCs I've been making around prior art and like future possibilities and stuff, we could amend the template to, for example, require tests and things like that. And then we can incrementally work with that to get where we want to get.
We've also done this already, right?
In what sense?
Like the NLL RFC and a bunch of others have already done this. Like there's prior art to doing an RFC by a more involved process than the RFC process. You're not allowed to like have the process be less involved, but if you make it more involved, nobody minds. So like we did the NLL, RFC, and in some other RFCs, I think, in a slightly different process.
But I think, right, there's one thing to start adding tests in the RFC in the ones we're making. Sure, that's a good idea. But I think we want to like change the minimum bar as well. So
Yeah, so I have two thoughts on this. I agree. So basically, I think we can hack around the system in some sense by saying, I mean, all the RFC process is a way to make decisions. It doesn't say much more than that. And to some extent, the Ling team can say, well, the way we're doing it for language design features, at least language design features of a certain complexity, is through this process that builds on the RFC, where the RFCs themselves are not like the final, they don't contain the, we don't expect to begin with an RFC that contains the full design. We expect to begin with these parts and make decisions as we go on. And that lets us, the good thing about that is it lets us sort of evolve the process and so on. I think it would, as long as we sort of document what we're doing and it's a good process, I don't think people will get mad about it. I do think it has the problem, which comes to what Central is saying, that there's a lot of pre-existing, there's a lot of RFCs floating there, and there's an official document that sort of says what you do. And like, we have to kind of be clear about what we're going to do with those pre-existing RFCs, how we're going to fit them into this, and also if new RFCs are being opened continuously, if they're following their own like lightweight, less complete process. I don't know. I think that's an important thing. So
right. That's why I think it's important to do some of the small changes for the new ones, so that we don't get like a constant stream of new RFCs that are not following the changes we want to make. Sort of. Another small hack that we could do is to simply change the documentation. Instead of saying we want a file, we now want a folder instead. That's a small thing that moves us in the right direction, I think.
yeah, I mean, I think we can also be more aggressive and just start closing new RFCs, but we do need to have some procedure for people to sort of get ideas in, I think. But
right.
So that's not how we do it now. We obviously should update the docs if we're going to do that.
Right. But I think we also need to do it for ourselves, because presumably there are some cases in which we want to file RFCs. Like ourselves, by ourselves, I mean we as members of the language team.
Right. Yeah, I mean, obviously we need to have this worked out. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what, like a little more than adding a test case. I feel like I don't want to design the whole thing end to end, but I also don't want to go so incremental that we're just adding a section to the RFC template. Although I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit about what would be like something we could do in the next month or something that involves some kind of staging and lets us change up how things are working. And then we can also like come back and say, well, we also add something to the template or something like that. Is that something that we think would be a good goal? I do, but I'm not sure if everyone agrees.
I think I don't know if this, so I've said this before. I think that like technical solutions like changing the tooling and changing and making the process more complicated will not be the only fix here, and I'm wary of introducing one without a technical fix without a social fix. So like I think we should try to have a more holistic thing approach than try to get it out piece by piece. Or I mean, if we get it out piece by piece, each piece should be like something that has both sides addressed.
So
and
yeah. maybe we should talk a little bit about what you mean by social fix. I mean, my view has been, and I still
Yeah.
has been that I think we will, if we can form kind of a better notion of working groups and a staging process, I think we are having a social fix. Like I don't view it as a technical fix. I view it as a social fix, but in the sense that it's helping to focus discussion and build up a sense of teamwork around a particular notion and basically get the idea of people are working together and not sort of fighting to stop a proposal, but rather working to agree on what a problem is.
The reason I agree with that. But one of the reasons I'm suggesting that we do these small things is that I think we will do them in any case. Like, if we want a more staged process, then splitting things up into quarters and so on and so forth is something that we need to do. So this is something that we could like fix today or like in a week or something. That's how quick we could do it. But I don't think we are fully agreed as to what a staged process means.
That makes some sense. Go on, Manish.
So I think okay, I do agree that like this is not just a technical fix, but I disagree that basically that this does not. I don't think this helps for create teamwork. This adds another layer of abstraction, but ultimately the abstraction that people see is the same. People see that there is a team and that there's not a team. It might not be the Lang team anymore. So like to the Lang team, the abstraction has changed, but to the other people, the abstraction has not changed. So the people who are like, oh, it's us versus them, will still feel it's us versus them. And that is not going to change without a stronger social fix. Like this is because like even I mean one thing I recall from the edition discussions is that what would often happen is that everybody involved in the Lang team would internally have a long discussion over various viewpoints internally and then come up with like a solution, and this would be a solution that has been discussed a ton and like almost all the trade-offs have been discussed, and then the moment it was put out, then people would view it as this is the Lang team's only opinion, this is what they want to push on us, we don't care about anything else. And then even though like, and people would not listen to the fact that this had actually been born out of discussion. And
Sure,
if this were done in public, I think if there's like a working group, sort of like temporary working groups being formed, you would still have the same effect around this. I think so. It's there's something that, and I think that staged RFCs still help here, but I think that they are not the only fix, and we should be careful that we're not just adding an additional layer without without shoring up the foundations to make it work.
Do you have some like more specific? I mean, are you thinking about, for example, what are you thinking about more concretely?
The facilitators thing is one thing I'm thinking about, but it's not the only thing. That is a large proposal, and I don't think that we should start off with that. But in general, I think some kind of more neutral sort of participation in, like, there has to be some kind of neutral entity that is not the people behind these changes involved here. It doesn't have to be a full-blown facilitator thing, but it has to be something that people trust. It could also be, it doesn't even have to be like an entity. It could just be that a rotating role. Like you could literally have a tendency in a discussion to ask someone to summarize the discussion so far, etc. Someone who is not on the Lang team, someone who is not on the working group. It doesn't have to be like there's a team of people doing this, but and that's one way of doing this. I think there are other ways to do this, but we'd have to investigate.
I think this is something used, like the role of a facilitator in discussions and summarizers is something I think we should always have. But the one thing that confuses me is I get the sense that you think that like the small fixes the small technical fixes that change how people write RFCs are somehow in conflict with the other changes that we
Oh no,
also.
no, no, no. I don't. I think that I am wary of introducing only technical fixes that will complicate the situation but not actually solve it without being paired with fixes like this.
Okay,
Uh, that is my fear, basically, because what that ultimately means is that that's more work for everyone involved, but the problem hasn't been solved. So it's basically a step back, and I want to be very careful of not doing that. Um,
So it seems to me, Manish, I agree with what you said. Uh, it seems to me that what you're talking about, if I sort of mentally divide this problem up into a few facets, and one of them is kind of managing sort of the overall process of how we're bringing the RFC things in, but the other is kind of just how do we actually conduct discussions and how do the working groups like function? And that
right.
seems to be a harder one. But
This
I think
seems
that's a lot to do with what you're saying. Like I think a lot of our troubles come around either because of I'm not even sure how important it is that there's a neutral entity actually, but I think it's just important that we summarize like period, uh,
right.
well,
and maybe do it in a
that's the
responsible
thing.
way. Um,
We used to do that, and that didn't improve things
no,
always.
I don't agree that we've ever
But
done that
shouldn't
very well. I mean, I agree we've
have
made
done it.
Okay,
posts,
yeah,
but I think that like we don't do a good job of we make them in the middle of a big thread. Like I think we've done a better job, for example, with the async 08 discussion, and I'm not sure it's exactly
yes,
right, but I think
I,
like there has to be a sense of we had this conversation, here was an outcome, and now we're at another phase of it. Go on. Sorry, Central.
I think it's sort of like the RFCs that are like need summarization the most are the hardest to summarize, and the ones that are easiest to summarize are the
the,
ones that need it least. Like
yeah,
some complicated type system thing that people don't comment on because they don't understand it.
yeah,
Those might really need like those are easier to summarize, but
yes,
um, um, I but I have the feeling that if we move to a more staged process where we have like folders and you might do some part of the RC at one time and we are more incremental, then it's easier to summarize
yes,
because you have to work with everything
yes,
at
and
once.
like I'm saying, I think that the stage thing is an improvement. I think that if we pair it with something that works to like a specific attempt to make these summarizations and stuff work better, I think it would have a much better impact. So, for example, like with the stage stuff, you can much more well with the stage stuff. I presume you'll have like separate discussion threads for every issue, every like medium-sized issue that's going on. So that makes it much easier to summarize. That said, you still have the problem that like if you think about the async await discussions, if you had a single thread on just the syntax, that would still be giant. There's not many ways to break that down further. Um, what you still need is something to sort of relinearize that discussion, stop it from going everywhere. And one of the problems is when it's a team member doing that, everybody who disagrees with you will be mad at you for writing down their opinion in a way they might not agree with.
Oh,
And
definitely. I
and
have
this
first-hand experience in this.
yes, and this is why like this is why I'm very trying to push for this to not be a team member, because ultimately like people will mess up when summarizing, and that's fine. You just don't want people to get more mad because of that.
Yeah.
So my
And
take is
and but
that
I
the concept of summaries is actually mildly flawed. Like I'm not sure about this, but I have this feeling that the idea that I will write a summary post and post it is inherently a WWIC failure. Like because it has weight, we should sort of be saying, we are now in a summarization phase. We are not introducing new arguments. We are summarizing existing arguments. This is something we didn't very much do in the async 08 discussion. Though we did it some, but it's partly for want of time and energy. But like it came very late, but I have done it in other discussions. And it felt very different to say like, I have a summary post. I want you to tell me where you think it doesn't represent your view so that I can sort of update it and make it reflect that. And then at the end, come back and then we have something we all agree is sort of like laying out things. And then we can come in and play our narratives on top of it. I think that's an interesting approach, but I think it takes some work.
Ideally, if we work in a more incremental fashion, then we can try to get more of like the discussion into the text itself.
Yeah.
And so one part of the summarization is to add it to the text.
Yes.
And then so one function of doing summaries is that new people who haven't read the stuff before or just coming to the RFC don't have to read the whole discussion. Like if you jump to the non-ASCII idents RFC, you have to scroll so many times, click so many times.
Yeah.
GitHub is so helpful.
Yes, this is also a goal of mine. I think this would be much more useful if like these summaries were like immortalized somewhere that's more than just a random comment in an issue. At the very least, they should be linked to from the top, but you can also put them in the RFC itself at various points once people sort of have agreement on what they are.
Right.
But yes, this is not easy to do.
And it's often like someone might think like this. I don't necessarily. The RFC author, don't agree with this, but this is how you can think. Which is a very reasonable thing to add to an RFC.
So it seems like I want to lay in a few comments. Oh, okay, go get some tea, Manish. That I'll lay in these comments.
My general sense is that the staging, like the incremental aspect, and the summarization aspect work good together. They enhance each other, but I don't think they are like one doesn't assume the other. They just enhance each other.
So I want to be clear. Like when I said that I want to pair technical fixes with, or like I want to pair these fixes together, I don't mean that we have to. It's more like I want us to be careful that whatever fixes we're introducing are not just creating more work without like actually solving the problem, because they just like they solve the problem in one direction, make the problem worse in the other. I just want to be wary of that. I want us to think about that. And one way to avoid that is to try solving the problem from multiple directions at once. The other way is just to think about this really hard and make sure that we're not doing anything that just moves the problem around.
Yeah, I mean, as a simple example, I feel like just look at this meta working group. I'm trying to do things like produce summaries and videos. I'm not actually doing a great job, I think, of getting these out there. Do I think this conversation is really like being absorbed by the community as a whole? No. So at this stage, I think I've created a lot more work without a lot more benefit. And I think this is what Manish is trying to avoid. But I want to add a few, and it's a meta comment.
I think we have, so one aspect of like, I think we've gotten more transparent with summaries and with YouTube videos and such. And one effect I think that this has had is that it's lessened the degree to which people are saying like there's less of a feeling that we are sort of in a dark room and here we have this decision and we haven't considered what people have said, because the video is showing that we have. I feel that this has been the case with async ways. Like there are people. there
I
are
think
things saying that we have considered things.
I definitely think that that's been helping. One thing I want to just throw out there is I want to jump back to something Manish said about having separate threads. I think Boats had a really insightful comment about this in one of their posts, talking about how adding more threads is like adding more lanes to a highway. Basically, that people will comment to fill the threads, but that I basically want to push back on the assumption that threads, like threads themselves, I think are necessary, but also part of the problem. They're not a great way for, at least it depends on what's happening. They're not always a great way to interact. And actually, Aaron, is it Aaron? I can't tell. From Aaron actually had some interesting thoughts along these lines as well. That said, of course, I think threads will always be with us, but what we don't, it's not enough to just say we're going to open a bunch of separate discussions. In fact, I think it's often useful to say the opposite, to say, here's a bunch of things that we know exist, but that's not what we're talking about right now. We've like focused our attention on this or that. I found that harder to do. That's sort of what the idea of the unsafe code guidelines was supposed to be like, and it's kind of worked. I think it's partly just, it's just people often, it's a matter of time as much as anything.
Yeah, so threads are like very much a case of Jevons paradox.
You have to explain that.
Oh, it's what is Jevons? I actually it's the same thing as the adding more lanes to a highway thing. Or well, I mean, it comes from, I think they made coal cheaper or something, and it ended up leading to more or they made some, it has to do with like coal and something that they made it cheaper, and it ended up like making the problem worse because now it was easier to use, so more people started using it. So then you had it had something. Anyway, look it up, Jevons paradox. It's exactly what we're talking about here, and that's why I want to kind of pair it with something like threads. Staging is something I think that is not a case of this, but it could be. Threads are definitely a case where what you're doing is pushing the problem elsewhere. And however, threads enable other solutions much better is my view on this. Like if you have threads, it's much easier to build solutions on top of it. Like staging is much easier done with threads. Facilitation is much easier done with threads. Another solution of like just locking specific discussions, and like Nico said, a summary phase. With threads, now you can say, okay, this discussion, I'm going to lock this. Let's put this in a summary phase for now. Then I'm unlocking it later, and let's discuss it again. You can like do a lot more little fun things with these things if it's broken into threads. However, threads themselves don't solve anything. They just like punt the problem on. So
as an example, I think it would be a good idea, now that we are soon going to stabilize 808, hopefully, to say that we're not discussing the syntax of 08 in this PR or issue. And we will, like, if you do discuss it, we will either just remove those comments or we will just hide them. And here is the previous discussion and all the like. Go read here.
I agree. I also think that we should focus on having definitive start and endpoints in these discussions, because I think that's a problem. A lot of things is they trail off, or people start from different assumptions. Like, for some people, they might want to talk about the syntax, but for others, it's clearly set in stone, so there's no point in talking about that. Like, everyone needs to know where we're starting from and what the goal is towards.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I like that a lot. I think both starting endpoints, but also trying to clearly lay out, like, don't start a thread that doesn't have, try to avoid starting threads that are unfocused, right? And say, try to focus them on what the purpose of the thread actually is. I feel like we've got a lot of, not to get too meta, but we've got a lot of interesting stuff here, and I'm wondering if we should go back and summarize, or like, can we extract from this? It seems like we're approaching on a sort of minimal, like
how many levels of meta are we at?
Meta discussion, but like specifically, we've definitely got a notion that we want a process that includes periodic that breaks down discussions, into finer grained threads rather than like one giant thread, and that includes summarization as sort of part of its structure, right? I think that at least we can say for sure. Does that seem right?
Right.
Yep. What I had imagined was that we would have the way that this would come about. I don't actually think this is enough, but I just want to toss it out there. I think I've done it before. Would be that summarization is done by periodically reporting. Basically, there's like a time-based notion of saying, well, we're going to take this. A lot of interesting conversation has happened. We're going to take it to the link team, and we're going to produce a nice summary that we post to the community, and then we present it to the link team, because probably most of the link team hasn't been paying attention. I don't know if that actually works, but it's a one model. I like this idea that it's something we do.
I have thoughts about that. I like the idea a lot because it seems very useful to get reports, but I haven't done any summaries about the grammar working group, and I should do it. Maybe that's too specific to my situation, but it hasn't happened.
You're basically saying it's too much work, or
maybe it's too much. Yeah, maybe it's just the form of the work. Like a report, you have to sit down and open a new document and do.
I also think even with these summaries and stuff, we aren't, or they are not surfaced correctly. Like the marketing on them is wrong. Like they just go on thread or onto internals, and then it kind of disappears, which a lot of people don't end up seeing. I think we need to address kind of how we surface these reports and stuff to a much broader audience of the Rust community.
Yeah, I thought that's a good. My main thought here is something around team blogs and things like that. But I have the same. I think there's the same problem around the compiler team. But maybe it's useful to look at what are some of the, like if we actually look at what work is being done by the Lang team right now, I think it is basically async await related design. It is possibly going to include this FFIC parity thing that has sort of not quite gotten started. There's grammar related work. There's some kind of trait related work. It's moving very slowly.
Not as slow as grammar.
Perhaps. And there's some stuff that's sort of not happening, or I don't know exactly what's happening. There's something related to constants. The fact that I don't know is an interesting side note to this.
I do.
Right. I assume somebody knows, but it's sort of not. I feel like the big picture is not in my head.
And there is a bunch of triage that we do all the time.
Oh, definitely.
I think that's most of the work, actually.
Yes. I really am thinking about the design efforts. And the reason I'm bringing them up is I'm wondering about, I feel like it would be helpful to try to get a little more concrete about, maybe the FFI is kind of a nice example, I think, because it's or whatever it's called, C parity. I don't know. That's already an interesting part of the question, but it's something we haven't started yet. We expect to start it. It's not super controversial, but it's also not uncontroversial. It would be interesting to think about how should that work proceed. Also, we expect there to be a significant number of people sort of putting time and energy into it. So we can some things I think get stalled just because it's like there's two people and they're doing it on their own time and in their volunteer time, and there's not a lot, and it's hard to progress is slow, which is of course something we need to account for. But
I think the higher team has many more work hours than the language team has on average.
many more what?
Work hours.
Yeah, it's easier, among other things.
Is it?
I mean, I think
it's just different.
it's more familiar at minimum. But I think the compiler team has been better. It's better. I don't know. Anyway, I agree with your assertion that there's more work hours.
Like I think I'm spending much more time on actually doing things to the compiler than I am doing language design at the moment.
Right, which seems not terrible.
Yeah.
But I think that that's something else, and this plain compiler interplay is a little bit. Well, so if we introduced, what would a minimal staging? I want to take the last 20 minutes, or I want to turn to. I acknowledge Manish's objection, and agree with it that we should not just make technical changes without also like trying to game out a little bit ahead if we're just making more work for ourselves. But we have to sort of start somewhere. So if we were to introduce some concept of staging, I think the most minimal one I can think of is like that we have a, we talked about this a bit last time. We have a motivational stage or explorational stage or something where you are sort of coming up with use cases, examples, probably tests, I think, but not maybe like a comprehensive test suite, but tests that are sense tests, like showing what you're trying to do and what the effects would be expected to be. And documenting possible approaches to solving the problem. And I note that I am not, I would like it if we can make this less of a, we are advocating for a particular thing as we are trying to really describe them. Sometimes there may not be many options, but if there are.
The tests are presumably linked to different approaches.
Yes, I would assume so. It's a good point. The problems, maybe not. The examples of difficulties. Although some approaches may solve, only a subset of the problems. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And then it seems like we have traditionally had like, I think there's a design and implementation stage, which I feel like we've somewhat, but not completely separated with our current RFC process, but I'm not convinced should be fully separated. Like there's a kind of a tension here always where people are, at some point, implementation should begin, and it's sort of unclear exactly where that should be. But this is basically where you've picked a specific approach that you think is most promising. I guess I should say the team has picked, probably.
It could be more than one. Right? You could implement two things.
Yeah, could be multiple approaches. And you're sort of designing it and starting to implement, creating tests, exhaustive test suite, looking for weird cases. I don't know whether there might be it might make sense to have a phase like we do today that's like, okay, we've picked an approach and we're going to do it a little bit more, until we have like enough to actually start implementing and hold, I don't know, but I kind of think we can just mix them in. And then there's like the most minimal thing is basically stabilization, right? But I think there's probably value in having a evaluation stage where you have documentation explainers available. And I think, yeah, like,
Depends on the size of the feature, I guess, with everything here.
yeah, I mean, I think some of these might go real fast and or just get skipped if like it just seems silly. Like it's
Yeah,
repper,
you just
repper enum
add one.
alignment thing, you know, whatever.
Yes. That one didn't even have an RC, so just
Right.
just went directly to implementation.
So I feel like these are the basic 4 stages. I think the interesting thing would be, I think there's some interesting questions around evaluation because we don't do that very well today. Especially because at the time you get to evaluation, you're probably not too keen on totally backing off from the approach, although sometimes we are. I don't know, it depends. Depends on how much work is invested. Like if somebody was going to say we should not do async await now, it's obviously non-starter. If we had these 4 stages, if you map this to the FFI group, like, okay, the first thing we should probably ask them to do then is try to like write out what are the set of goals. I feel like a working group probably takes some ideas, some set of ideas through these stages, right? But it can manage potentially more than one idea. Like the ideas have to be grouped first into units and advancing. So like FFI, I don't know, var args or whatever, the bit fields is independent from something else. It seems like going through a stage could be an RFC. That's what I would think. But
what determines when someone goes from one stage to another, and like if they should?
Yeah, that's what I was just going to say. This is the interesting question. I tend to think we should probably wind up with RFCs that we mostly know are going to pass already also, but that's a side step. But yeah, what determines? Well, to go into one, so obviously there has to be consensus that it's a good idea. We should have some criteria. So what determines when to go? I think, okay, there's a special case when to begin exploration / form a working group. I think that should be something we do. Like, I think we sort of do that. We just say, oh, anybody can explore. And that's fine. That's of course true. But there should be some sort of like, we decided that we want this change. And that means that you now have some confidence that the work you're doing has a path, or at least has a desire. But let's leave that aside. So there have to be some criteria. I imagine to go to the design and implementation stage, it should be like, I mean, it's probably different per stage, right? Like to go here, there should be some write-up with compelling examples. It should have, it can have unresolved questions and be at not too much detail, but it should sort of cover all known approaches in at least some detail. We should have selected one or more approaches. And we should have people from compiler team who agree to work on it.
Or someone, not necessarily a compiler team.
No, I think compiler team. I think you need a reviewer. They don't have to be the one who does
For
all the
sure.
coding, though. Like,
Right.
I'll give an example today, which I think is where I think this.
That
I
is
think we
much
don't do
more
a good
easy.
job. We don't do a good job with these resources. Like, I'm super happy that, like Alex is working on the associated type balance, trait balance, for example. But I feel terrible that I haven't been able to keep up with the reviews. And in general, that's like a tricky thing. I think we should think about that as a real thing. But it could just be a real
we with the addition RFCs, and I kind of want to write a separate thing about this at some point, but there was a lot of the addition migration. There was much less thought put into that from the compiler point of view, and basically this meant that as an implementer, I had to run between like building consensus ad hoc after the RFC had landed, so that I could implement it. And I think this is sometimes that sometimes this happens, and we definitely should have compiler team people saying, yeah, this will lead to the kind of code that we're okay with in the compiler. Like this is not going to completely rip up the compiler internals when we want to implement it. And if the answer is no, then you have to like have a discussion on how to get there.
So that's an interesting question. Is there some, does it make sense to have, like, is there some notion of what are the major pieces of work that have to be done? An initial idea of that? Is that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is something I always do. I always talk to someone from the compiler team to see if this is something that is feasible to implement and like how much work it takes. Maybe I do some checking myself.
Right.
I assume everyone is doing that.
So we could produce like a template for this, right? Like I imagine that if we were going to say that going between stages is RFCs, there might be distinct templates for each one. Which.
So one question: when you say compiler team, who do you mean? Do you mean the members? Because we have a lot more reviewers than that.
I mean people with review permission.
So that is a very different
So
group.
contributors. We have an official team for this.
Right. Well, even that group is too narrow because I can review things.
Well,
I can.
Who are qualified to review. Yeah. So let's put it this way. You need to have someone who will implement, and you need to have someone who will review and is qualified to review. That's sort of, may or may not be a compiler team. And I think one of the things, like, in terms of the overall implementability, like, in general, I think that's not a big concern, but if there's, for some reason, a specific concern around implementability or like that should be something that you kind of identify as a risk if you feel like it's horrible hazard, but I'm not too worried about that.
Right. And it may be that, to take one example, the constant in array repeat expressions was not implementable for some time, but now it is because of the work on NL.
Yeah.
So that you might not be able to implement it immediately, but you sort of need some path for it.
Is there, I feel like in terms of communication, I'm just looking, this is like we're basically talking about you have to have an adventuring party, right? You have to have the key roles, one member from each class. Sorry, D on the mind, I guess. But I'm wondering if there's like, I think we should not leave out documentation, and we should not leave out like organizational and blog. But I don't know that, it might just be that we want to write down these are things that have to get done. But I think
could those things be requirements that the reviewer puts on the other members of this team / party to require that documentation?
I mean, we can come back to this topic. We've been kind of unsuccessful at requiring documentation so far. I would like us to try to do better, but I don't exactly know what that means.
Well, in terms of the reference, like, we're not in a place where we can require this because we don't have any like base to build on. Like, if we make some type system change, we don't have an implementation in Agda or POC or something, or even like typing rules somewhere which we can change. So there is nothing to add to.
Yes.
Maybe just some informal text, but that is not
It's something we should
that
improve.
much.
I'm more thinking in any case about like blog posts and explainers and so on. Like, we're saying it's a lot of work to get these things done. We should think about them as work items, but I don't know what that means yet.
What we need for that is a bunch of PhDs.
No, we do not need a bunch. It's the last thing we need. I mean, we need that for the reference
For
or
the,
something. Maybe.
yes, yes.
Okay. Yes. Not for like.
I think I think we had a synchronization error there.
Yes. Okay. Now I understand.
Sorry.
For the evaluation stage, this is, I feel like what we need is actually similar to what we now call stabilization report, except I think we should do it, like you should have, except some things we don't, but there should be something that you, basically there should be a report that we can post to the world that says, hey, this feature that you're excited about is ready for you to bang on it. Here are some instructions on how to use it. Here's some stuff about how it works. And, you know, test cases that show the, well, they don't want to see the test cases, but we'd like to see enough tests to be sure that it's going to work at all. And that would be a cool thing to have. And maybe maybe simple things skip this phase. I don't know. But if for those things where we do explicitly want feedback, which happens, like infiltrate and so on. One question I have is, maybe evaluation isn't a phase per se, or you could, like, it seems like you might do several, you might over the course of design implementation want to call attention to certain questions on a regular basis, like being able to say, hey, like there's like a final phase of evaluation perhaps, but it might be saying, we'd like to know if people think this syntax is working well for them, you know, can we call attention and ask this question or something like that? It's essentially a tool and not so much a phase. I don't know. But all right, so for test cases, we know.
I've got another meetings, but this was really good. Thank you.
Yeah, I gotta run into because my freezer broke and the repairman will be here soon. And currently my ice is melting all over the kitchen floor. But
all right, see ya.
See you later.
Yeah. Can you send the stock somewhere?
Yes, I will post it in the internals thread corresponding to this.
Cool. All right, see ya.
We have a lot of ICEs for you to work on.
Yeah.
In other places.
Oh dear. So today we have this, like, where did we diverge from the RFC concept?
Yep. And what did we not
trying to figure out. Yeah, it feels like that's not, there's something missing in this list of things because there's sort of no RFC to diverge from. We said you're entering the design. There needs to be some intermediate step of like, well, I don't know, maybe that's what the evaluation is or something, but of like, here's a design that we're pretty happy with. What do you all think? Does everyone else agree?
So I'm writing a report right now for the underscore stuff, and what it has is like what is stabilized, what is not, and both in terms like what is stabilized both in terms of
Sorry.
What a user might think about and what someone who is writing the reference might think about, and like what is not stabilized, divergences and unresolved questions, tests, and then a history of what has happened. Like
To run
SPR,
what you said, but I'll listen to the recording later. But said repairman is at my door, so maybe we'll pick this up next time, I guess, or discuss on internals.
Yeah.
All right.
Sure.
Thanks, y'all. So.
Thanks.